This is a book review of George MacDonald's Phantastes, published in 1858, sometimes with the subtitle A Fairy Romance for Men and Women. It is often regarded as the first fantasy novel in the fantasy genre that we know. Not the first story with fantasy in it, but not the first fairy tale, but the first sort of fairy tale written for adults. I was surprised to learn that. I first got into reading, really started loving reading when I got into Dragonlance and Dungeons and Dragons style books as an elementary school student. And then I sort of got out of fantasy and I've been in the classics for a while. And then somehow this popped up on my radar and I decided to give it a try. And I'm glad I did. And in this book review, I'm going to tell you, I'm not an expert on this. I haven't read any other analyses of it. I'm just going to give you some of my takeaways and what it brought to my mind. And a quick summary. A quick summary is there is this young man just after his 21st birthday. He inherits a desk, a secretary from his father. And as he's going through it and he opens up one of the drawers, a little fairy pops out, and suddenly his life takes a detour into fairyland. He finds his room starts to alter and shift, and suddenly he's in a fairy forest, and he's going into cottages, and the book slowly takes you along the journey. I believe his name is Anados, which has a meaning of pathless. I did read that. This young 21-year-old man who is now confronted with fairies, and he's meeting humans who live on the border of fairyland. Some of them believe in fairies, they can see them, and some of them can't see them, and they do not believe in them. And this whole idea that there are some humans, some of us, that have a closer connection to fairyland, and some of us who cannot see them, cannot hear them, and even the mention of them is preposterous. And it reminded me of this idea that when we are children, our senses are more alive, and some of us are able to keep our senses alive longer. Some of us might have a proclivity towards that. I'm not telling you that to watch out, there are fairies all about you, but in a way, there could be, because this is what I wanted to talk about, what it reminded me of. It reminded me of my psychedelic journeys. I have taken many. This is not a video about psychedelics. This is a video about Phantastes by George MacDonald, but his story of Anados going into this fairy realm, this realm that coincides right next to the human realm. There's just this border, this thin border, and you can cross into it and you can go deep into it, and the various levels of receptivity towards it opens it up to you or closes it off from you. Reminded me so much of my psychedelic journeys, because right now, I haven't taken psychedelics in a long time. The world just seems like a normal world, There's buildings there, there's a policeman down there, there's a McDonald's down there, I walk here, do this. But when you take psychedelics, depending on how strong of a dose, suddenly the world takes on a bit of a more spiritual and a more vibrant character. And a lot of it has this meaning, and one of the things you might come to conclude is it's actually all around us all the time, all of this magic in this world, but somehow our normal sober state, we don't really usually sense it and feel it all of the time. There are artists, perhaps, or people who meditate in nature or do certain yogas that can contact that more often. But for a lot of people, we need to take these psychedelic substances, whether they're magic mushrooms or LSD or ayahuasca or something that gets us into this we call psychedelic space when we're talking about psychedelics, but it reminded me so much of George MacDonald's Phantastes, this fairy land. So many parallels. For example, one of the things, if you research psychedelics, is that the way our brain normally functions is that we have most access is sort of shut off. Our brain sort of limits our consciousness. Our brain limits our consciousness from taking too much in because we got to stay alive and accomplish our goals. But when you take some substances or do some activities, it sort of allows the brain, different areas of the brain to connect, sort of shuts down the central default network, and allows more reception, that's why they're called consciousness expanding drugs. And I felt that was a good parallel with Phantastes, because there is this receptivity to the fairyland. And in fairyland, things they're right here, they're connected to the real world, but they could easily be invisible if your receptivity isn't on. And just like in Anados, the main character, the birds, when they're singing, he actually understands them. Same thing with psychedelics. Oftentimes when I've taken psychedelics, like when I see the birds flying, it's like, and they're like not sending messages, but there's a lot more meaning to the movement of animals, movement of all life, in fact. More meaning in rocks and trees than would be in a normal coffee, cigarette state. So just this parallel between, if you're someone who's taken a lot of psychedelics, and the biggest challenge when you take psychedelics is finding the vocabulary and the words to explain these experiences. If you've taken them, I think you might enjoy reading George MacDonald's Phantastes, and then consider, this observation, and you can tell me if I'm absolutely crazy, but that his description of the fairyland actually was constantly reminding me, maybe not in every page, but constantly reminding me of my psychedelic voyages. And another thing that it reminded me a lot of was Carl Jung. I've read a lot of Carl Jung. I read a lot of Carl Jung actually after taking many psychedelic voyages to help me understand what's going on. It's going in your inner world, the deep parts of your psyche, the deep parts of your soul. Carl Jung made just some phenomenal books and essays about what goes on inside of a person, the map of the soul, shall we say. And he also used a lot of fairy tales, a lot of myth, to explain what happens inside of us. And one of the reasons myth and fairy tales are so powerful is because it's not just a story about a goblin and a princess or a dragon. Those things have corresponding relationships with parts of our psyche, with archetypes, or with different things. For example, in Phantastes by George MacDonald, there's I don't want to say character, but it's a part of Anados, and it is its own character. His shadow suddenly becomes aware to him, and he is afraid of his shadow, but also has to contend with it. And overall, Anados is on this journey of becoming, I don't want to say an enlightened human, but developing his consciousness, his understanding of love, heroism, self-sacrifice, and many, many good virtues. And the shadow is a part of that. And in Carl Jung, if you read Carl Jung, one of the things you will realize is that anyone on the path to individuation, which is Carl Jung's sort of path towards becoming a real human, a real fully, not a fully aware, but a fully developed, matured human, you need to go through a psychic individuation, is confronting your shadow. And the shadow in Carl Jung is the aspects of yourself that you do not want to admit or confront, the things that you've sort of swept under the rug. You don't want to talk about that part of yourself. And in one very big confrontation in Phantastes by George MacDonald, Anidos is feeling so proud that he killed a giant, and he's wearing this shiny armor. He's just sort of strutting on a beautiful horse, and then he confronts his shadow in the shape of an even bigger, grander version of himself, falls under his power, and then goes through a very, very dark period. But ultimately comes out lighter and freer than before, and perhaps even thankful for that experience. And eventually, I don't want to spoil the story, but there's a lot of themes in here, themes on death, themes on getting rid of your ego and yourself, to really do what is right in your soul. It's a pretty spiritual book, but it's also just an entertaining fantasy book. Although I wouldn't really, it's a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale for men and women, for adults, or young adults even, or the childlike, which is something that George MacDonald had said. I recommend it for anyone, but particularly for people who might be interested in the psychedelic connection or the Carl Jung connection. That's Phantastes, which I read in my e-reader by George MacDonald, 1858, considered the first modern fantasy book, and deeply influenced C.S. Lewis, had an influence on J.R.R. Tolkien, and Carol Lewis was, I believe, I don't know, a student or a friend. He considered George MacDonald a mentor, and George MacDonald, who wrote Phantastes, was instrumental in Lewis Carroll, his Alice in Wonderland being published. It's a good book. It's not that long. I recommend it. Write your comments down below. My name's Ryan. Bye-bye.